My name is Maria Alvarez Johnson, and I'm 67 years old. What I'm about to tell you will change how you see every quiet person in your neighborhood forever. For 3 years after my husband Robert passed away, everyone in Maple Ridge treated me like I was one step away from the poorhouse. They whispered behind my back, calling me the poor widow who couldn't even afford to fix her fence. But last Tuesday, when the Hendersons put their dream house up for sale, the same house they'd been bragging about wanting for 5 years, I walked into the real estate office and bought it with cash, $850,000, just like that. You should have seen their faces when they found out who outbid them. But this story doesn't start with revenge. It starts with love, loss, and the biggest mistake my neighbors ever made: underestimating a woman who learned to be invisible by choice, not by circumstance. Let me take you back to the beginning, to when Robert and I first moved to Maple Ridge 15 years ago. We were both 52 then, him with his salt and pepper beard, and me with hair that was just starting to show silver threads. We'd saved every penny for 25 years to buy our modest two-bedroom house on Elm Street. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. Robert worked as a maintenance supervisor at the local college, and I cleaned houses for some of the wealthier families in town. We weren't rich by any stretch, but we were happy. Every evening, we'd sit on our small front porch, him reading the newspaper while I worked on my crossword puzzles, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes up and down our quiet street. The Hendersons lived 3 houses down in what everyone called the nicest house on the block, a beautiful colonial with white columns and a perfectly manicured lawn. Patricia Henderson, with her blonde highlights and designer handbags, would wave at us from her BMW, but it was the kind of wave you give to people you consider, well, beneath you. Her husband, James, was a real estate developer, always talking loudly on his phone about million-dollar deals while washing his luxury car in the driveway. Then there were the Kowalskis next door, Mike and Susan. Mike worked at the bank, and Susan taught at the elementary school. They were friendlier than the Hendersons, but I always sensed they saw us as the help. Susan would ask me to recommend cleaning services for her friends, assuming that's all I knew about. The Garcias across the street were closer to our age and income level. Elena and I would sometimes chat over the fence about our gardens, but even they seemed to think Robert and I were just scraping by. "It must be hard," Elena would say, "living on just his salary." If only they knew. You see, what none of them realized was that Robert wasn't just a maintenance supervisor. He was also one of the smartest investors I'd ever met. While they saw a man in work clothes fixing broken pipes and changing light bulbs, I saw a financial genius who had been quietly building our future for decades. Every month, Robert would take a portion of his paycheck, money our neighbors assumed we needed for basic expenses, and invest it. He studied the stock market like other men studied sports. He read financial newspapers until late at night, researching companies, analyzing trends, making careful, calculated decisions. "Maria," he'd tell me as we sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by financial documents, "the key to wealth isn't how much you make, it's how much you save and how smart you are with what you save." By the time we moved to Maple Ridge, Robert's investments had grown to over $400,000. But we lived like we had $4,000. We drove our 10-year-old Honda until it literally couldn't run anymore. I shopped at thrift stores and clipped coupons. Robert packed his lunch every day in the same worn lunchbox he'd used for 15 years. Our neighbors saw poverty. We saw strategy. "Why don't we buy a nicer house?" I asked him once, watching Patricia Henderson show off her new kitchen renovation to a group of neighborhood women who had gathered in her driveway. Robert smiled and squeezed my hand. "Because, mi amor, the best wealth is invisible wealth. Let them think we're struggling while we're actually winning." He was right, as always. While the Hendersons were leveraging themselves to the hilt to maintain their lifestyle, while the Kowalskis were living paycheck to paycheck despite their good jobs, while everyone around us was drowning in debt to keep up appearances, we were quietly becoming millionaires. But then, 3 years ago, everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and the maple trees on our street were showing off their autumn colors, brilliant reds and golds that made the whole neighborhood look like a painting. Robert had gotten up early, as he always did, to make us coffee and read the financial news before work. I was still in bed when I heard the crash. The sound of his coffee mug hitting the kitchen floor, followed by a thud that made my heart stop. I ran to the kitchen and found him collapsed by the counter, his face gray, his breathing shallow. "Robert!" I screamed, dropping to my knees beside him. "Stay with me, baby. Stay with me." The paramedics arrived within minutes, but I could see in their eyes that it was bad, very bad. As they worked on him, loading him into the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of Patricia Henderson watching from her front window, her face pressed against the glass like she was watching a television drama. At the hospital, the doctor, a young man who looked like he should still be in college, delivered the news with clinical detachment. "Mrs. Johnson, your husband has suffered a massive heart attack. We've done everything we can, but the damage to his heart is extensive. I'm sorry." Robert died at 3:47 p.m. on October 15th, holding my hand, whispering, "Te amo, Maria," with his last breath. The funeral was small. Robert had been a private man, and we didn't have many close friends in Maple Ridge. The neighbors came, of course. It's what you do in a small community. But I could see them calculating in their heads, wondering how the poor widow was going to afford the funeral expenses, let alone survive on her own. Patricia Henderson approached me at the graveside, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Maria, honey, if you need anything, anything at all, you just let us know. I know money must be tight now." Susan Kowalski nodded in agreement. "The church has a fund for families in need. There's no shame in accepting help." Even Elena Garcia, who I thought knew me better, whispered, "Mija, you know you can always come to us if you can't make the mortgage payments." They meant well, I suppose, but their assumptions stung more than they could have imagined. Here I was, grieving the loss of my soulmate, and all they could see was a poor old woman who would probably lose her house within the year. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Robert had left me with more than just memories and grief. He had left me with a portfolio worth $1.2 million, but I wasn't ready to tell them that, not yet. The first year after Robert's death was the hardest of my life. Not because of money. I had more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my days. The hardship was emotional. 43 years of marriage doesn't end easily. Every morning, I woke up expecting to smell his coffee brewing. Every evening, I sat on our porch alone, the empty chair beside me a constant reminder of what I'd lost. But something interesting happened during that first year. The more my neighbors saw me struggling emotionally, the more they assumed I was struggling financially. And the more they assumed I was struggling financially, the more they treated me like a charity case. It started small. Patricia Henderson would bring over casseroles, "Because I know you probably can't afford to eat out much anymore." Susan Kowalski would drop off bags of clothes her teenage daughter had outgrown, "Because I thought you might be able to use them." Elena Garcia would invite me over for dinner, "Because you shouldn't be eating alone all the time, and I know groceries are expensive." At first, their kindness touched me. These women were trying to help in the only way they knew how. But as the months passed, I began to notice something else in their behavior, a condescension that made my skin crawl. They spoke to me differently now, slower, louder, as if grief had somehow affected my hearing or intelligence. They made decisions for me without asking. Patricia organized a neighborhood collection to help with my expenses without consulting me first. Susan signed me up for the senior discount program at the local grocery store and proudly presented me with the card like it was a gift. "We just want to make sure you're taken care of," Patricia explained when I tried to politely decline their charity. "Robert would have wanted us to look out for you." The worst part was how they talked about me when they thought I couldn't hear. I'd be working in my garden and I'd catch fragments of their conversations over the fence. "Poor Maria, she's really struggling. I heard she's behind on her electric bill. Someone should talk to her about selling the house before she loses it. It's so sad. She used to be so proud. Used to be so proud." As if poverty had somehow humbled me, made me more palatable to them. But here's the thing about being underestimated: it gives you power. While they were busy feeling sorry for me, I was quietly managing my investments, watching my wealth grow even without Robert's steady contributions. The stock market was having a good run, and Robert's carefully chosen portfolio was performing beautifully. By the end of the first year, my net worth had grown to $1.4 million. I started to see my neighbors' assumptions as a kind of protection. As long as they thought I was struggling, they wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about how I was really managing. They wouldn't wonder why I never seemed to be looking for work, or how I could afford to keep the house, or why I wasn't applying for government assistance. So I played the part they expected me to play. I shopped at discount stores, making sure to use coupons when they were around to see. I wore the same black dress to church every Sunday, not because I couldn't afford others, but because it reinforced their image of the poor widow. I let my garden get a little overgrown, not because I couldn't afford a landscaper, but because a perfectly maintained yard might raise questions. I became invisible in plain sight. The second year brought new developments in the neighborhood dynamics. The Hendersons, who had always lived beyond their means to maintain their image, were starting to show cracks in their perfect facade. James's real estate development company was struggling. I'd overhear him on his phone calls, his voice getting more strained with each conversation. "I just need another month," he'd say. "The permits are almost approved." Or, "The investors are just being cautious because of the market." Patricia tried to maintain appearances, but I noticed she was shopping at the same discount stores where she'd seen me, though she'd quickly hide her cart if she spotted me in the aisles. Her BMW got traded in for a Honda, the weekly lawn service stopped coming, and James started mowing their own grass. But the biggest change came when they started talking about their dream house. It was a beautiful Victorian mansion on the other side of town, in the historic district where the old money families lived. The house had been empty for 2 years, owned by an elderly woman who had moved to a nursing home. It was everything the Hendersons thought they deserved: 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a wraparound porch, and enough prestige to erase any doubts about their social status. "Once James's big deal goes through," Patricia would tell anyone who would listen, "we're going to buy the Morrison house. It's been our dream for years." She'd show pictures on her phone to the other neighbors, describing in detail how she would redecorate each room, how they would host elegant dinner parties, how their children would finally have the kind of home that reflected their family's true worth. The asking price was $850,000. I knew this because I had been quietly researching the property myself. Not because I wanted to buy it. My little house on Elm Street held too many memories of Robert for me to ever want to leave. But I was curious about the real estate market in our area, and the Morrison house was one of the most significant properties to come up for sale in years. What the Hendersons didn't know was that the elderly owner, Mrs. Morrison, was getting desperate to sell. She needed the money for her nursing home care, and the house had been sitting empty for so long that she was starting to consider lower offers. What they also didn't know was that James's big deal was falling apart. I'd overheard enough of his phone conversations to piece together that his investors were pulling out, his permits were being denied, and his company was on the verge of bankruptcy. But Patricia kept talking about their dream house as if it were a sure thing. "We're just waiting for the right moment to make our offer," she'd tell Susan Kowalski during their morning walks. "James wants to make sure we get it for the right price." Meanwhile, she'd look at my little house with its peeling paint and overgrown garden, and I could see the pity in her eyes. "Poor Maria," she'd whisper to Susan. "She'll probably have to sell soon. I heard she's been asking about reverse mortgages." I had never asked about reverse mortgages, but I let her believe what she wanted to believe. The third year after Robert's death brought the event that would change everything. It was a warm Saturday in June, and I was sitting on my porch reading a book when I overheard a conversation that made my blood boil. Patricia Henderson was hosting what she called a neighborhood coffee in her backyard, basically an excuse for the women on our street to gather and gossip. I could hear every word from my porch, though I don't think they realized how clearly their voices carried. "I feel so sorry for Maria," Patricia was saying. "She's really let herself go since Robert died. Have you seen her yard? It's becoming an eyesore." "Someone should talk to her about selling," Susan Kowalski added. "She's clearly in over her head. The house is too much for her to maintain. The property values are going to suffer if she doesn't do something soon," chimed in Jennifer Walsh, a newer neighbor who had moved in the year before. "My realtor friend says houses like hers bring down the whole street." But it was Elena Garcia's comment that cut the deepest. "It's just sad," Elena said. "She used to have such dignity. Now she's just pathetic. Always in those same old clothes, never fixing anything, probably eating cat food to make ends meet. Robert would be ashamed to see what she's become. Robert would be ashamed." Those words hit me like a physical blow. These women, who had never really known my husband, who had never seen the love and respect we shared, were now using his memory to justify their cruelty. I sat there on my porch, my hands shaking with rage, listening to them dissect my life like I was already dead. They talked about me like I was a problem to be solved, an embarrassment to be hidden, a burden on their perfect little community. "Maybe we should organize an intervention," Patricia suggested. "Get her some help. There are programs for people like her. People like her, people like me." That's when I made my decision. I had been content to live quietly, to let them think what they wanted while I enjoyed my financial security in private. But they had crossed a line. They had insulted Robert's memory, questioned my dignity, and treated me like I was less than human. It was time to show them exactly who Maria Alvarez Johnson really was. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Robert's old financial documents spread out in front of me. My portfolio had grown to $1.6 million, thanks to some particularly good investments in technology stocks that Robert had picked years earlier. I had more than enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, even if I lived to be 100. But comfort wasn't what I was thinking about anymore. I was thinking about justice. I picked up my phone and called David Chen, the financial advisor who had been managing my investments since Robert's death. David was a kind man in his 40s who had always treated me with respect, never talking down to me or assuming I didn't understand financial matters. "Mrs. Johnson," he said when he answered, "how are you doing?" "I'm doing well, David. I need to ask you about liquidating some assets." "Of course. What did you have in mind?" "I want to have $850,000 in cash available within the next 2 weeks." There was a pause. That's a significant amount. "May I ask what it's for?" "I'm going to buy a house." "A house? Are you thinking of moving?" I smiled, even though he couldn't see me. "No, David. I'm thinking of making a statement." Over the next week, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I paid attention to how I looked. I went to the salon and had my silver curls professionally styled. I bought a new dress, not expensive, but well-fitted and elegant. I had my nails done for the first time since Robert's funeral. The neighbors noticed, of course. I saw Patricia Henderson watching from her window as I got into a taxi to go to the salon. I heard Susan Kowalski whisper to her husband about how I was putting on airs when she saw me in my new dress. Let them wonder. I also did my research. I found out everything I could about the Morrison house, its history, its condition, its true market value. I learned that Mrs. Morrison was indeed getting desperate to sell and that several potential buyers had fallen through due to financing issues. Most importantly, I learned that the Hendersons had never actually made an offer on the house. All of Patricia's talk about waiting for the right moment was just that. Talk. They couldn't afford it, and they knew it. But I could. On a Tuesday morning in late June, I walked into Henderson and Associates Real Estate, James Henderson's own company, wearing my new dress and carrying a leather portfolio that had belonged to Robert. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, looked at me with barely concealed disdain. I suppose I didn't look like their typical client. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that suggested she'd rather not. "I'd like to speak with someone about the Morrison property on Maple Street," I said calmly. "Oh." She looked surprised. "Are you interested in viewing it?" "I'm interested in buying it." Her expression shifted from disdain to confusion. "I see. Well, let me get one of our agents to speak with you." She disappeared into the back office, and I could hear hushed whispers. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit emerged. "Mrs. Johnson, Maria Alvarez Johnson." "Mrs. Johnson, I'm Tom Bradley. I understand you're interested in the Morrison property?" "That's correct." He gestured toward his office. "Please, have a seat." Now I should mention that this is a very expensive property. The asking price is $850,000, and we typically require proof of financing before we can arrange viewings. I opened my portfolio and pulled out a bank statement. "Will this suffice?" Tom Bradley's eyes widened as he looked at the numbers on the page. The account balance showed $1,847,000. This is your account?" "It is." "And you're interested in purchasing the Morrison property?" "I am. In cash. Today, if possible." For the next hour, Tom Bradley treated me like royalty. He called Mrs. Morrison personally, arranged for an immediate viewing, and had his assistant prepare all the necessary paperwork. The transformation in his behavior was remarkable and telling. The Morrison house was even more beautiful than I had imagined. The Victorian architecture was stunning, with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and period details that had been lovingly maintained. It was far too big for one person, but that wasn't the point. "I'll take it," I said after a brief tour. "Wonderful. Now, about financing arrangements." "Cash," I repeated. "I can have a cashier's check for the full amount by tomorrow morning." Tom Bradley's smile could have powered the entire town. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves that much money. By Wednesday afternoon, the news that someone had bought the Morrison house for cash was all over Maple Ridge. But nobody knew who the buyer was. Tom Bradley was being discreet, as good realtors should be. I watched from my porch as Patricia Henderson paced in her driveway, talking frantically on her phone. I could only imagine the conversations she was having, trying to find out who had swooped in and bought her dream house. "It has to be someone from out of town," I heard her tell Susan Kowalski. "Some rich developer, probably. No one local has that kind of cash." James Henderson looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His company had lost what would have been their biggest commission of the year, and he still didn't know who had bought the property. That evening, Elena Garcia knocked on my door. "Maria, mija, have you heard the news about the Morrison house?" "What news?" I asked innocently. Someone bought it. For cash. Can you believe it? Patricia is beside herself. She's been planning to buy that house for years. Oh my, I said, that must be disappointing for her. It is. She's convinced it was some rich outsider who doesn't even care about the neighborhood. She's talking about trying to find out who it was and maybe convincing them to sell it to her instead. I nodded sympathetically. Well, I'm sure whoever bought it had their reasons. Elena looked at me with the same pitying expression I'd grown to hate. At least you don't have to worry about things like that, mija. Sometimes it's better to have simple needs. Simple needs, if only she knew. I let them wonder for exactly 1 week. 7 days of watching Patricia Henderson drive by the Morrison house multiple times a day. 7 days of listening to the neighborhood gossip mill work overtime. 7 days of being treated like the poor widow who couldn't possibly understand the excitement over such an expensive property. On the following Wednesday, I made my move. I had arranged for a moving truck to arrive at the Morrison house at 10 a.m. Not because I was moving in immediately, but because I wanted to make sure everyone would see it. I also arranged for a landscaping crew to begin work on the grounds and for a cleaning service to arrive with their clearly marked van. Then I got dressed in my best outfit, a navy blue dress that Robert had always loved, paired with the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 25th anniversary, and walked down the street to the Morrison house. Patricia Henderson was already there, of course, standing on the sidewalk with Susan Kowalski and Jennifer Walsh, trying to get information from the moving crew. "Excuse me," Patricia was saying to one of the movers. "Do you know who hired you? We're neighbors, and we'd love to welcome the new owner to the community." The mover shrugged. "Lady paid us in cash. Nice lady. Said she'd be here soon." That's when I walked up. "Good morning, ladies," I said pleasantly. "Oh, Maria," Patricia said dismissively, barely glancing at me. "We're trying to find out who bought this house. You should probably head home. There's going to be a lot of activity here today." "Actually," I said, pulling the keys from my purse, "I think I'll stay." I walked up to the front door and inserted the key into the lock. The silence behind me was deafening. I turned around to see 3 faces frozen in shock, their mouths literally hanging open. "Surprise," I said with a smile. "That's impossible," Patricia Henderson whispered, her face pale. "You can't, you don't have, how did you—" "How did I what?" I asked calmly. "Buy a house? With money?" Susan Kowalski found her voice first. "Maria, I don't understand. Where did you get $850,000? "From my bank account," I replied simply. Jennifer Walsh, who had been the most vocal about my supposed poverty, looked like she might faint. But we thought you were—" "Poor?" I finished for her. "Yes, I know what you thought. You've made it very clear over the past 3 years." Patricia Henderson's shock was quickly turning to anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't afford this house. You probably got some kind of loan, or maybe it's a scam. I'm going to call the real estate office and find out what's really going on." "Please do," I said, handing her Tom Bradley's business card. "Tell him Maria Johnson called. He'll be happy to confirm that I paid cash." As Patricia fumbled with her phone, more neighbors began to gather. Word was spreading quickly that something dramatic was happening at the Morrison house. Elena Garcia arrived just as Patricia was finishing her call to the real estate office. I watched Patricia's face crumble as Tom Bradley apparently confirmed what she didn't want to believe. "It's true," Patricia said in a hollow voice. "She really bought it. Cash." Elena looked at me with confusion and something that might have been hurt. "Maria, why didn't you tell us? All this time we thought we were trying to help you." "Help me?" I repeated, Is that what you call it when you talk about me like I'm pathetic? When you say my husband would be ashamed of me? When you treat me like a charity case who's too stupid to manage her own life? Elena's face flushed red. I never said. Last Saturday, I continued, in Patricia's backyard, you said I was pathetic, that I was probably eating cat food, that Robert would be ashamed of what I'd become. The gathered crowd was growing larger, and I could see people pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming the neighborhood event of the decade. You want to know the truth? I said, my voice carrying clearly in the morning air. My husband left me very well provided for. We had been investing for decades, living below our means while you all lived beyond yours. When Robert died, I inherited a portfolio worth over $1 million. Gasps rippled through the crowd. But I let you think I was poor because it was easier than dealing with your judgment about that too. I've watched you all struggle to keep up appearances, going into debt to maintain lifestyles you can't afford, while looking down on me for supposedly being in the same situation. I turned specifically to Patricia Henderson. You've spent 3 years talking about buying this house, but you never made an offer because you couldn't afford it. Your husband's business is failing. You've been shopping at discount stores and you traded in your BMW because you couldn't make the payments. Patricia's face was now bright red. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Buy a house with my own money? Stop pretending to be poor so you could feel better about yourselves. James Henderson had arrived and was standing behind his wife, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. This is insane, he said. You're just a cleaning lady. You can't have that kind of money. I was a cleaning lady, I corrected. I was also a woman whose husband was smart enough to invest our money instead of spending it on appearances, and now I'm a woman who owns 2 houses, including the one you've been dreaming about for 5 years. The crowd had grown to include most of the neighborhood, and I could see people streaming the confrontation live on social media. This was going to be all over town within hours. I don't believe it, Patricia Henderson said, her voice shaking. Show us proof. Show us bank statements. I don't owe you proof of anything, I replied, but since you've spent 3 years speculating about my finances, I'll give you some facts. I pulled out my phone and showed them a screenshot of my investment account balance, $1,847,000. The crowd erupted in whispers and exclamations. When my husband died, I continued, he left me with investments worth $1.2 million. Over the past 3 years, while you've all been feeling sorry for the poor widow, that money has grown to nearly $2 million. Susan Kowalski stepped forward, her face a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. But Maria, why did you let us think? Why didn't you tell us? Because you never asked, I said simply. You assumed. You saw a widow in modest clothes and decided I must be struggling. You saw me using coupons and decided I must be desperate. You saw me keeping to myself and decided I must be ashamed. I looked around at the faces in the crowd, some shocked, some embarrassed, some angry. The truth is, I've been living exactly the life I wanted to live. I dress modestly because I'm comfortable that way. I use coupons because I don't like wasting money. I keep to myself because I value my privacy. But you all decided that meant I was pathetic. Elena Garcia had tears in her eyes. Maria, I'm so sorry. We were just trying to help. Were you? I asked. Or were you trying to feel better about your own financial struggles by having someone to look down on? The silence that followed was deafening. Let me tell you what help actually looks like, I continued. Help is asking someone what they need instead of assuming you know. Help is treating people with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Help is not gossiping about your neighbor's private business. I turned back to Patricia Henderson, who was still staring at my phone screen in disbelief. Patricia, you've spent 3 years talking about this house like it was your destiny. You've shown pictures to everyone, planned renovations, acted like it was just a matter of time before you could afford it. But you never could afford it, could you? Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Your husband's business is failing. You're behind on your mortgage. You've been living on credit cards for months, and instead of dealing with your own problems, you've been focused on mine. James Henderson stepped forward aggressively. You have no right to talk about our private business. The same right you had to talk about mine, I replied calmly. The difference is, your assumptions about me were wrong. My observations about you are based on the phone calls I've overheard from my porch for the past year. The confrontation was drawing to a close, but I had one more thing to say. I want you all to understand something, I said, addressing the entire crowd. I didn't buy this house because I need it. I bought it because I could. Because for 3 years, you've treated me like I was less than you, like I was someone to be pitied and managed and talked about behind my back. I gestured toward the beautiful Victorian mansion behind me. This house represents everything you thought I could never have: success, status, financial security. You looked at me and saw failure. You looked at my life and saw something to be ashamed of. I paused, letting my words sink in. But the real shame is how you treated a grieving widow, how you turned someone's loss into gossip, how you decided that because I didn't live the way you thought I should live, I must be living wrong. Patricia Henderson finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What are you going to do with the house? I smiled. I'm going to live in it. I'm going to enjoy every room, every view, every detail that you spent 5 years dreaming about. And every time you drive by, you're going to remember that the poor widow you looked down on was actually the richest person on this street. The crowd began to disperse, people walking away in small groups, their voices buzzing with excitement and disbelief. I could already imagine the phone calls that would be made, the social media posts that would be shared, the way this story would spread through our small town like wildfire. Elena Garcia approached me as the crowd thinned. Maria, she said softly, I owe you an apology. A big one. Yes, I agreed. You do. I never meant to hurt you. I really thought we were helping. Elena, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You meant well, but you never bothered to find out what I actually needed. You just assumed. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Is there any way? Can we start over? I considered her question carefully. Elena had been kinder than the others, but she had still participated in the gossip, still treated me like a charity case. Maybe, I said finally, but it would have to be different. No more assumptions, no more pity, no more talking about me like I'm not capable of managing my own life. I understand, she said. I'll do better. As Elena walked away, I stood alone in front of my new house, my $850,000 statement to the world that Maria Alvarez Johnson was nobody's poor widow. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The story of the poor widow who bought the neighborhood's dream house had spread far beyond Maple Ridge. Local news stations picked it up, then regional papers, then national websites. I found myself at the center of a story that resonated with people across the country. The headlines were variations on the same theme. Widow shocks neighbors by buying $850,000 house in cash. The poor widow who wasn't. Underestimated woman gets ultimate revenge. I received hundreds of messages from people sharing their own stories of being underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed because of their age, appearance, or circumstances. Many were from widows who had faced similar assumptions about their financial situations. Others were from people who had been judged for living modestly while secretly building wealth. One message particularly touched me. It was from a young woman named Sarah who wrote, "My grandmother lived through the Depression and always dressed simply and saved every penny. When she died, we found out she had over $500,000 in the bank. She never told anyone because she said people treated her better when they thought she needed help. Your story made me understand her better." The attention wasn't all positive, of course. Some people criticized me for showing off or being cruel to my neighbors. A few suggested that I should have used the money for charity instead of revenge. But for every critical comment, there were 10 supportive ones. People understood that this wasn't really about a house. It was about dignity, respect, and the right to live your life without being judged by others' assumptions. The Hendersons, meanwhile, were dealing with their own fallout. James's business troubles became public knowledge after the confrontation, and they were forced to put their own house on the market within a month. They moved to a smaller rental across town, and I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Patricia had taken a job at a department store. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall. Their problems weren't caused by me. They were caused by years of living beyond their means and making poor financial decisions. My revelation had simply brought their situation into the open. Susan Kowalski made several attempts to apologize and rebuild our relationship, but her efforts felt hollow. She was more embarrassed about being wrong than sorry about how she had treated me. Elena Garcia, on the other hand, seemed genuinely committed to change. She stopped by regularly, not to offer help I didn't need, but to have real conversations about gardening, books, and life. Slowly, carefully, we began to rebuild a friendship based on mutual respect rather than assumed need. 6 months after buying the Morrison house, I was finally ready to move in. I had spent the time having it professionally cleaned and making small updates while preserving its historic character. I hired local craftsmen to restore the original hardwood floors and repair the stained glass windows. I had the wraparound porch rebuilt to match the original Victorian design. The house was magnificent, but it was also enormous for one person. As I walked through the 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, I realized I needed to find a purpose for all this space that went beyond making a point to my former neighbors. That's when I had an idea that would have made Robert proud. I decided to turn the Morrison house into a resource center for widows and elderly women who were facing financial challenges, not because they lacked money, but because they lacked knowledge about managing it. I would offer free financial literacy classes, investment workshops, and estate planning seminars. The irony was perfect. The house that my neighbors thought I could never afford would become a place where other women could learn to build the kind of wealth that had made my purchase possible. I partnered with David Chen, my financial advisor, to develop a curriculum. We covered everything from basic budgeting to advanced investment strategies, from understanding insurance policies to planning for long-term care. The first workshop was held on a Saturday morning in October, exactly 1 year after I had bought the house. 23 women attended, ranging in age from 45 to 78. Some were recent widows, others were divorced, and a few were simply women who had never been taught about money management. "Welcome to the Morrison Financial Literacy Center," I said as I opened the first session. "My name is Maria Alvarez Johnson, and I'm here to teach you something very important. You are never too old, too poor, or too late to take control of your financial future." I told them my story, not the dramatic version that had made the news, but the real story of how Robert and I had built wealth through careful planning, modest living, and smart investing. I explained how assumptions about my financial situation had actually protected my privacy and allowed me to grieve without unwanted interference. The most important lesson I can teach you, I said, is that wealth isn't about how much money you make. It's about how much you keep and how wisely you use it. One of the attendees, a 62-year-old woman named Dorothy, raised her hand. But Mrs. Johnson, what if we don't have much to start with? Dorothy, I replied, my husband and I started with nothing. We were both from working-class families. We never made six-figure salaries, but we saved consistently, invested wisely, and lived below our means. Time and compound interest did the rest. Over the following months, the workshops grew in popularity. Women drove from neighboring towns to attend. Some brought their daughters or granddaughters. A few brought their husbands. The local newspaper wrote a follow-up story about the transformation of the Morrison house from a symbol of unattainable wealth to a center for financial empowerment. The headline read, "From Dream House to Teaching House, Widow Turns Mansion into Learning Center." 2 years after the confrontation that changed everything, I was sitting on the wraparound porch of the Morrison house, reading the newspaper and enjoying my morning coffee. It was a beautiful spring day, and I could see the tulips I had planted blooming in the front garden. A car pulled up to the curb, and I was surprised to see Patricia Henderson get out. She looked different, older, more tired, but also somehow more genuine than I remembered. She walked up the front path hesitantly, as if she wasn't sure she was welcome. "Hello, Maria," she said when she reached the porch steps. "Hello, Patricia. I was wondering if I could talk to you for a few minutes." I gestured to the empty chair beside me. "Please, sit down." She settled into the chair and looked out at the garden for a moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "A real one, not the kind I tried to give you that day when everyone was watching." I waited for her to continue. "I've had 2 years to think about what happened, about how I treated you, about why I treated you that way." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I think I was so afraid of being poor myself that I needed someone to look down on, someone who I could tell myself was worse off than me." It was the most honest thing I had ever heard Patricia say. "When James's business started failing," she continued, "when we started having real money problems, I couldn't face it. It was easier to focus on your supposed problems than deal with my real ones." "And now?" I asked. "Now I'm working at Macy's. We're renting a 2-bedroom apartment, and James is driving for Uber while he tries to rebuild his business." She smiled ruefully. "And you know what? We're actually happier than we were before. We're not pretending anymore." I nodded. "Pretending is exhausting." "It is." She looked at me directly for the first time since sitting down. "I heard about what you're doing here with the financial workshops. It's wonderful." "Thank you. I was wondering," she hesitated, "would it be appropriate for me to attend one of your sessions? I realize I have a lot to learn about managing money responsibly." I studied her face, looking for signs of the old Patricia, the condescending, judgmental woman who had made my life difficult for 3 years. But all I saw was someone who had been humbled by circumstances and was genuinely trying to do better. "The next workshop is Saturday morning at 10, I said. "You're welcome to join us." Relief flooded her features. "Thank you. I know I don't deserve your kindness after how I treated you." "Patricia," I said gently, "we all make mistakes. The question is what we do after we realize we've made them." She stood to leave, then turned back. "Maria, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Buying this house, I mean. Making such a public statement?" I considered her question carefully. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. But not for the reasons you might think." "What do you mean?" "I didn't buy this house to hurt you or to show off my wealth. I bought it because I was tired of being invisible, tired of being dismissed, tired of having my life managed by people who didn't know anything about me. I gestured toward the house behind us. This house gave me a platform to tell my story, and that story has helped hundreds of other women realize they don't have to accept other people's assumptions about their lives. It's become something bigger than revenge. It's become a tool for empowerment. Patricia nodded slowly. I never thought about it that way. The best revenge, I said, isn't hurting the people who hurt you. It's using their underestimation of you to accomplish something they never thought you could do. 5 years have passed since I bought the Morrison house, and my life has changed in ways I never could have imagined. The Financial Literacy Center has helped over 500 women take control of their financial futures. Some have started their own businesses, others have built substantial investment portfolios, and many have simply gained the confidence to make their own financial decisions without relying on others. I've written a book about my experience called The Invisible Wealth, A Widow's Guide to Financial Independence. It became a bestseller among women over 50, and I've been invited to speak at conferences across the country. The neighborhood has changed too. The Hendersons eventually moved back to a modest house 2 streets over after James successfully rebuilt his business with a more conservative approach. Patricia completed my financial workshop series and has become one of my most dedicated volunteers at the center. Susan Kowalski and her husband divorced, and she moved to Florida to be closer to her sister. Elena Garcia and I have become genuine friends, bonding over our shared love of gardening and our weekly book club meetings. New families have moved into the neighborhood, and I've made it a point to welcome them without assumptions about their circumstances or needs. I've learned that the best way to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that plagued my early years as a widow is to approach people with curiosity rather than judgment. My investment portfolio has continued to grow, now worth over $2.5 million. But more importantly, I've learned to use my wealth as a tool for positive change rather than just personal security. Last month, I established the Robert Johnson Memorial Scholarship Fund, which provides financial education and investment seed money to young women from working-class families. It's my way of honoring my husband's memory while ensuring that future generations of women won't have to choose between financial security and social acceptance. As I sit here on my porch this morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I think about the journey that brought me to this moment. The pain of losing Robert will never completely fade, but it has been transformed into something purposeful. I think about the woman I was 5 years ago, grieving, isolated, allowing others to define my worth based on their assumptions. And I think about the woman I am today, confident, empowered, using my voice and my resources to lift up others. The neighbors who once called me the poor widow now call me the lady who runs the financial center, or simply Maria. The change in how they see me reflects a change in how I see myself. I am not defined by my husband's death or my neighbor's assumptions. I am not limited by my age or my appearance or others' expectations. I am Maria Alvarez Johnson, a woman who learned that the most powerful thing you can do when people underestimate you is prove them wrong, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. And sometimes the best way to prove them wrong is to buy the house they thought you could never afford, then use it to help other women realize they're capable of far more than anyone ever imagined. The poor widow they pitied for 3 years was never poor at all. She was just waiting for the right moment to show the world who she really was. And that moment, it turned out, was worth every penny of $850,000. My name is Maria Alvarez Johnson. I'm 67 years old, and I'm not the poor widow they thought they knew. I never was, but Patricia Henderson and the rest of my neighbors, they lost their assumptions the moment they decided to underestimate the power of a woman who chose to be invisible until she was ready to be seen. The house they dreamed about for 5 years now teaches other women that wealth isn't about what people see. It's about what you build in silence. And sometimes the best revenge isn't just proving them wrong, it's using their underestimation to create something beautiful that helps others long after the shock has worn off. They called me the poor widow for 3 years. Now they call me the woman who turned their dream house into hundreds of women's financial dreams come true. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see other stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.